What happens when the air suddenly goes cold, not because of the weather, but because death itself has entered the scene? What happens when a man who built his career on speaking loudly, boldly, and unapologetically is silenced by a single pull of a trigger? That was the shocking reality at Utah Valley University, a moment that began like any other conservative rally but ended in a scene that would dominate headlines across the nation. Charlie Kirk, a name millions recognize, wasn't just another speaker standing at a podium. He was 31 years old, brash, fiery, controversial, loved by some, loathed by others, but undeniably a voice that made people pay attention. Whether you admired his work with Turning Point USA or disagreed with every word that came out of his mouth, one thing was certain. When Charlie Kirk spoke, people listened. And on that Wednesday in Orem, Utah, they listened, until they were forced to listen to something else entirely. The crack of a rifle. The screams of students. The chaos of a life stolen in an instant. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But here's the chilling part. The man accused of pulling that trigger, Tyler Robinson, didn't flinch when the world turned its eyes on him. He didn't cry. He didn't confess. He didn't even cooperate. The silence of the accused became almost as haunting as the sound of the gunshots themselves. Why? What was he hiding? Or was his silence the only power left in a world where his fate was already sealed by DNA, evidence, and a nation's fury? Let me ask you directly. When you hear that someone's DNA was found wrapped around a weapon of murder, do you need more proof? Or does the evidence scream louder than any courtroom testimony ever could? Investigators didn't just stumble upon a crime scene. They pieced together a trail that was almost cinematic in its detail. On the rooftop of Utah Valley University, they found a screwdriver. Innocent enough, right? Except this screwdriver carried the suspect's DNA. And then came the towel, dark, ordinary, forgettable, except it was wrapped around the rifle believed to have ended Charlie Kirk's life. And whose DNA stained that towel? Tyler Robinson's. Do you see the contradiction here? A young man refusing to speak, yet his very skin cells, his genetic code, shouted his guilt from the rooftops. Literally. And it wasn't just the police saying it. This wasn't a small-town sheriff's department trying to stitch together a case. The words came from none other than FBI Director Kash Patel himself, confirming live on national television that the DNA matched. That wasn't just evidence. It was a bombshell that told America this case wasn't going to fade quietly into the background. But before we rush into the courtroom, before we look at Robinson's reaction to the life sentence that would send him spiraling into his own personal hell, we need to step back into that day. Imagine the scene. Bright Utah sky, the smell of fresh air mixed with the restless energy of college students, conservative banners waving, chants echoing, phones raised to capture every second. Kirk takes the stage, his trademark fire lighting up the crowd. Then, silence. A sound that cuts through human noise, the unmistakable crack of a gun. Do you know what's terrifying? Gunfire in a confined space is deafening. It rattles bones. But outdoors, in the open, it echoes differently. It's sharp, jarring, and confusing. For a split second, no one knows what it is. Fireworks? A prank? Until people start falling. Until screams ripple through the crowd. Until bodies scatter like frightened birds. The irony couldn't be heavier. Here was a man who built a movement around protecting America, silenced in the heart of the very country he fought for. A man who spoke endlessly about threats to free speech, cut down in the middle of exercising that very right. Doesn't that strike you as more than coincidence? Doesn't it feel almost symbolic, as if this wasn't just an act of violence, but a message? And then, the spotlight shifted. Tyler Robinson, a name no one in that crowd knew before the gunfire. A face that blended into anonymity until it was plastered across news outlets. 22 years old, young enough to still be finding his way, old enough to know exactly what pulling a trigger meant. What drives someone like him to commit an act that rips through families, divides a nation, and makes him the villain in a story that will never be forgotten? We don't have all the answers yet. That's the truth. Some say it was ideology. Others whisper about mental health, about hidden grudges, about motives that will never fully come to light. But one thing is undeniable. The evidence tied him to the crime scene. Not his words, not a confession, but the cold, scientific certainty of DNA. And this is where the story takes its most haunting turn. Because even as the evidence stacked up, Robinson sat in silence. He didn't confess. He didn't deny. He didn't cooperate. He simply existed in the eye of a storm, watching as the world raged around him. Think about that. A man accused of murdering one of the most well-known conservative activists in the country, and he chooses silence. Isn't that eerie? Doesn't it make you wonder what goes through the mind of someone like that? But here's where things get darker. When the trial began, when the prosecution laid out the DNA, the rifle, the rooftop evidence, the defense had almost nothing to hold on to. The walls were closing in. And yet, Robinson held himself still. It was as if he already knew how this story would end. And maybe he did. Because when that verdict was finally read, when the judge uttered the words that would define the rest of Robinson's life, the courtroom didn't just hear a sentence. It witnessed a fall. A fall so dramatic, so absolute. It was like watching a man tumble into hell itself. Life. No parole. No chance of redemption. Just bars, walls, and the memory of a single Wednesday afternoon that destroyed everything. But before we explore that courtroom moment, before we break down Robinson's reaction to hearing his fate, there's something you need to understand. This case isn't just about one man's crime. It's about the fragility of life, the cost of political division, and the chilling reality that in America, even a university campus, even a rally under the sun, isn't safe from the shadow of violence. And yet, despite all of this, there's still a detail, a twist, that changes the way you'll see this entire story. Something about the evidence, the behavior in court, and the whispers in the prison halls that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Because while Tyler Robinson may have fallen into hell the moment he heard his verdict, what happened after made this case even darker. And trust me, you haven't heard the half of it. What does it feel like to witness history twisting into tragedy right before your eyes? One moment you're clapping, cheering, waving your phone in the air to capture a fiery speech. And the next, the sound of a single rifle shot cuts through the noise, rewriting everything. That was the brutal reality of September's afternoon at Utah Valley University. Charlie Kirk's rally wasn't just another campus event. It was an open-air gathering that felt like part pep rally, part protest, part cultural war in real time. The sun was blazing over Orem, the crowd restless but buzzing with energy. Students, parents, activists. They came not just to listen, but to be part of something bigger. You could feel it in the way people leaned forward, the way chants swelled and then fell into silence as Kirk took the mic. Picture it, banners flapping in the Utah breeze, signs that read, "Protect free speech," the steady hum of phones recording live feeds for Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And then Kirk appeared, not as a polished politician, but as the loud, brash, familiar voice of Turning Point USA. He raised his hand, the crowd roared, and for a fleeting second, the world seemed simple. Until it wasn't. The crack of the gun came like lightning splitting a calm sky. One sound, then chaos. Have you ever been in a crowd when panic hits? It's not just about running. It's about confusion. People look around, their brains scrambling to understand. Was it fireworks? A prank? Then the screams. Then the blood. And in seconds, the truth becomes undeniable. Someone is down. Someone important. Someone everyone came to see. Charlie Kirk collapsed on the stage, his bodyguards rushing forward, the microphone screeching with feedback as it hit the floor. Gasps turned into shrieks. The crowd became a storm of bodies pushing outward, desperate to escape an invisible threat. And through it all, the shooter slipped away, leaving behind not just a body but a nation's burning question. Why? But here's the thing about moments like these, they don't just vanish. They burn themselves into the memory of every witness. Some students later said they could still hear the sound of the shot days later, like a drumbeat in their heads. Others said the image of Kirk falling haunted them when they closed their eyes. Isn't that what violence does? It doesn't just take life, it infects the living with fear. And yet, amid the chaos, investigators were already piecing together a trail. Police combed the rooftop overlooking the stage, looking for vantage points. That's when they found it. The screwdriver, the towel. Seemingly ordinary objects, but carrying extraordinary weight. DNA clung to them like whispers that refused to stay silent. Here's where the contradictions start stacking up. Tyler Robinson, the man accused, wasn't confessing. He wasn't cooperating. But his DNA was everywhere it shouldn't have been. Doesn't that strike you as the cruel irony of crime? The killer tries to disappear, to vanish into the crowd, but his very cells betray him. His silence screamed guilt louder than any shouted confession ever could. And while the investigators followed this trail, the public turned to grief and anger. Kirk's supporters demanded justice. His critics, though stunned by the violence, couldn't ignore the symbolism. A conservative firebrand silenced mid-speech. Was it political? Was it personal? Or was it something else entirely, something more random, more terrifying? Now pause for a moment. Imagine being one of those students. You went to campus for an event, for an argument, for a debate. Instead, you walked away with blood on your shoes, sirens in your ears, and nightmares you didn't sign up for. Do you think they'll ever forget that day? Do you think America will? But here's the detail that chilled even seasoned investigators. The shooter didn't act like someone in hiding. He acted like someone who had already surrendered to fate. Tyler Robinson was tracked down, arrested, and even then, silence. No cooperation. No explanation. Just a cold stare that made detectives wonder if he even cared about what he had done. And yet, as the evidence mounted, as the DNA tied him like a chain to the scene, there was still a question hanging in the air. A question no one could answer yet. Because if Robinson really was the killer, why that moment? Why Charlie Kirk? Why Utah Valley University? The answers, investigators believed, were buried in the trial that was about to come. A trial that would force every witness to relive that afternoon, every juror to confront the evidence, and Tyler Robinson to face what he had done, or at least, what the evidence screamed he had done. And the closer the trial came, the more the nation leaned in. It wasn't just about a murder anymore. It was about a movement, a symbol, and a verdict that would decide whether justice had truly been served. But when the courtroom doors finally opened, no one could have predicted the reactions, the testimonies, or the chilling silence that followed. Because what happened inside those walls didn't just convict a man, it revealed the cracks in a country already split apart. And it all started with one question. Who really was Tyler Robinson? Who was Tyler Robinson? That's the question everyone wanted answered. Because a crime of this magnitude doesn't just come out of thin air. People wanted to know. What kind of 22-year-old walks into a rally, armed, and changes the course of a movement with a single act of violence? Was he a radical? Was he mentally unstable? Or was he simply another young man consumed by bitterness, rage, and a sense of purpose twisted in the wrong direction? Let's start with the basics. Tyler Robinson wasn't a household name. He wasn't a known activist. He wasn't on FBI watch lists, at least not publicly. He was just a face in the crowd until he wasn't. And that's what makes this story even more disturbing. Because the idea that someone so seemingly ordinary could commit such an extraordinary act of violence shakes people to their core. Doesn't it make you uneasy to think that anyone, your neighbor, your classmate, the guy you pass in the grocery store, could carry the seeds of something this dark? Robinson grew up in Utah, surrounded by the kind of environment that doesn't usually make national headlines. Small town, suburban, unassuming. His classmates describe him as quiet. Some say shy. Others, though, hint at something else. An intensity that came out in flashes, a temper when he felt cornered, a strange obsession with feeling overlooked. Isn't it always like this? After a tragedy, the puzzle pieces suddenly fall into place. People recall warning signs they brushed off at the time. But hindsight always speaks louder than the present moment. At 22, Robinson was at an age where many are figuring out who they are. College students, young professionals, kids barely stepping into adulthood. Yet while others his age were building careers or exploring freedom, Robinson's choices pushed him down a darker road. He reportedly drifted from odd jobs, never staying long. Friends, if you could call them that, noticed his increasing isolation. In an age where everyone is connected, Robinson seemed more disconnected than ever. And here's where things take a chilling turn. Investigators are still piecing together his digital footprint, his online activity, his searches, his comments. Was he radicalized? Was he influenced by darker corners of the internet? Because in today's world, we know how easy it is for someone disillusioned to fall into a digital echo chamber. A place where anger festers, where ideas aren't challenged, just reinforced, until violence feels not just possible, but inevitable. But let's not oversimplify. To say Robinson was just radicalized feels like an easy answer. There's more to it. He wasn't shouting slogans or leaving manifestos, at least, not yet. He was silent, and that silence is haunting. Don't you think silence is often more dangerous than noise? A person ranting online gives you something to track, something to anticipate. But someone brooding in the shadows? That's the person you never see coming. Now, imagine the irony. Charlie Kirk, a man whose career was built on using his voice, was silenced by someone who barely used his. The contrast is striking. A public figure who thrived on debate versus a young man who refused to say anything, even when faced with evidence, charges, and a courtroom. Doesn't that strike you as symbolic? And yet, there were glimpses into Robinson's psyche. According to reports, he was never cooperative with investigators. Not once. He didn't explain why. He didn't deny anything. He didn't offer remorse. Think about that. A young man sitting in custody, his life dangling in the balance, and he chooses silence. Was it defiance? Was it arrogance? Or was it emptiness? Nothing to give, nothing to lose? But here's the contradiction that gnawed at everyone. While Robinson gave nothing, his DNA gave everything. It was as if his body betrayed him. The towel around the rifle, the screwdriver left behind, his genetic fingerprints etched into the crime scene. Doesn't it feel almost poetic? A man who tried to vanish into anonymity, undone by the microscopic particles of his own being. Yet this only deepened the mystery. Because people wanted to know, was Robinson acting alone? Was he targeting Kirk specifically, or was Kirk simply a symbol in the wrong place at the wrong time? The prosecutors believed the evidence was airtight. But the motive? That was murkier. And in that murkiness, speculation thrived. Some whispered that Robinson hated Kirk's politics, that he wanted to make a statement by silencing him. Others insisted it was more personal, that Robinson had some private vendetta no one had uncovered yet. And then there were those who believed Robinson was just broken, lost, spiraling, and the act was less about politics and more about pain. So let me ask you, what do you think? Was Robinson a mastermind with a message? Or was he just a fractured soul who made a catastrophic decision? As the trial approached, journalists and investigators scrambled to paint his portrait. They wanted the story behind the face. They wanted to explain the inexplicable. But sometimes, the truth isn't a neat narrative. Sometimes, it's jagged, messy, contradictory. Robinson was young, but old enough to know better. Quiet, but loud in the destruction he caused. Silent in words, but deafening in the consequences of his actions. And yet, one detail stood out more than any other. When investigators presented the DNA evidence, Robinson didn't react. No protest, no visible shock, no plea of innocence. Just stillness, as if he had already surrendered to the outcome. Isn't that the most chilling part of all? A man who seemed prepared to fall into hell without even attempting to climb out. But if Robinson's silence was haunting, the evidence itself was damning. The DNA was undeniable, and the prosecution knew they had the key to lock the case shut. And as they prepared to unveil it, the nation held its breath. Because the next step wasn't just about proving guilt. It was about making Robinson's silence irrelevant. His DNA would speak for him. His actions would drown out his silence. And when those first pieces of forensic evidence were revealed, the story took a turn from mystery into certainty. The trial wasn't just beginning. It was tilting heavily in one direction. But how exactly did investigators connect those rooftop clues to Robinson so quickly? And why did the FBI director himself decide to go public with the revelations? The answers, as you'll see, made the case explode far beyond the courtroom walls. What happens when silence is broken not by words, but by science? When the suspect refuses to speak, yet the evidence on the crime scene screams his name louder than any confession ever could. That's exactly what happened in the case of Tyler Robinson. The man accused of killing Charlie Kirk tried to sit stone-faced, mute, and detached. But while his lips stayed sealed, his DNA betrayed him. His body itself became the witness against him. It began on that rooftop. Picture it. Police, FBI agents, crime scene techs moving like shadows across the campus. The crowd had fled. The screams had faded into the distance. What remained was a silence thick with dread. Investigators combed the area, their eyes scanning every inch for something, anything, that could explain what happened. And then, tucked among the discarded items and debris, They found the first clue, a screwdriver. Innocent enough on its own. But in criminal investigations, even the simplest objects can tell the loudest stories. On that screwdriver, swabs revealed the first undeniable trace of DNA. It was Tyler Robinson's. His genetic fingerprint was stamped on the metal as if mocking his silence. Doesn't it chill you to think about it? While Robinson said nothing, this tool, this ordinary, everyday object, spoke volumes. But that wasn't all. Next came the towel. A dark-colored cloth, ordinary and unremarkable, except for what it concealed. Wrapped around the rifle that police believed fired the fatal shot, was the fabric that carried traces of sweat, skin cells, and biological signatures. And whose DNA did it carry? Again, Tyler Robinson's. 2 separate items. 2 different surfaces. 2 matches. Do you know how statistically damning that is? In forensic science, DNA hits like this are not coincidences. They are chains, binding suspects to crime scenes with mathematical certainty. Now pause. Imagine Robinson hearing this in court. His defense team scrambling. The prosecution laying out the results like a dagger to the heart of the case. Robinson didn't flinch. He didn't protest. He didn't say a word. Silence. But that silence was deafening because the evidence roared louder than any denial could. And here's where things get even more dramatic. This wasn't a local sheriff making the announcement. It wasn't even a county prosecutor. It was FBI Director Kash Patel himself going on Fox and Friends, telling America in real time that the DNA evidence linked Robinson directly to the crime scene. Think about that. The head of the FBI, a national figure, chose to personally go on television and say, the DNA hits are positive. The suspect in custody is tied directly to the towel and the screwdriver. Why does that matter? Because it turned a Utah courtroom case into a national story. This wasn't just about Charlie Kirk anymore. It became a debate about safety, politics, justice, and the role of law enforcement at the highest level. When the FBI director speaks, America listens. And when he says the evidence is airtight, the narrative shifts. Suddenly, Robinson wasn't just accused. He was branded, scientifically and publicly, as the man responsible. But here's the contradiction, and it's one that gnaws at you if you think about it. If the evidence was so overwhelming, why wasn't Robinson talking? Why not confess? Why not deny? Why not try to explain away the DNA? That eerie silence made people wonder if there was something else. Something deeper. Was he protecting someone? Was there a larger plot? Or was this simply the twisted pride of a killer who refused to play along? Doesn't that raise the hair on your arms? Because silence, in the face of certainty, feels like something out of a psychological thriller. It's one thing to deny. It's another to stay utterly quiet while science paints you guilty. And then came the emotional weight. For Kirk's supporters, the DNA evidence wasn't just proof, it was closure. It meant that justice had a path forward. For his critics, it raised other questions. Why did this happen? What was the motive? The evidence tied Robinson to the act, but not to the why. And that's where the story twisted further. Because while the DNA sealed Robinson's guilt in the courtroom of facts, it left a gaping hole in the courtroom of motives. And jurors don't just want to know what happened, they want to know why it happened. Here's another contradiction that hit hard. DNA is cold, clinical, and undeniable. But trials are emotional, human, and messy. Prosecutors could wave around lab reports and match statistics all day long, but they still had to convince a jury that Robinson wasn't just present. He was the one who pulled the trigger. And while the towel and screwdriver connected him, the rifle itself carried its own story, a story that would make jurors lean forward in shock. Because buried in the ballistics, the fibers, and the forensic residue was a tale of preparation. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was planned, calculated, premeditated. And that revelation struck deeper than any single piece of DNA ever could. So here's the question for you. What chills you more? The idea of a man screaming his hate from the rooftops? Or the thought of someone silently, carefully, methodically planning the end of a man's life, then sitting in court without a word, as if his fate was already sealed? But the DNA wasn't the last revelation. It was only the start. Because once the evidence hit the headlines, once the FBI director himself weighed in, the political world erupted. Governors, senators, media personalities, they all wanted their say. And when Utah's own governor stepped up to the microphone, His words added a new layer of weight to the already explosive case. Because what Governor Spencer Cox revealed shocked even those who thought they'd heard it all. Imagine this. The nation is already shaken. The courtroom is bracing for what's next. The evidence has been laid bare by the FBI director himself. And then the governor of Utah steps up to the microphone. His voice isn't just another commentary. It carries the weight of the state, the authority of leadership, the raw grief of a community blindsided by violence. That's when Governor Spencer Cox delivered a statement that made headlines coast to coast. But here's the question. Why did the governor feel compelled to speak at all? Governors don't typically weigh in on local criminal trials. They don't step into the fray unless the moment demands it. And that's what made Cox's words feel like a thunderclap. Because in his voice, you could hear not just political obligation, but something deeper. Fear, frustration, and the unshakable sense that Utah's sense of safety had been shattered. Governor Cox didn't mince words. He called Tyler Robinson uncooperative. He told the public bluntly that the suspect had not confessed. He revealed that Robinson wasn't helping investigators at all, that he sat in silence even as the evidence screamed. And that revelation sparked a wave of contradictions in the public's mind. How could a young man, faced with overwhelming DNA evidence, simply refuse to engage? Let me ask you, if you were innocent, wouldn't you fight? Wouldn't you scream from the rooftops that the system got it wrong? But Robinson didn't. His silence wasn't just suspicious, it was damning. And Cox knew it. That's why he went public. He wanted the people of Utah to understand that the system wasn't being handed a neat, tidy confession. Instead, law enforcement had to claw its way toward justice, dragging Robinson through the weight of evidence while he gave them nothing. That's not cooperation, that's defiance. Now here's where the emotional beats come in. The governor's statement wasn't just about Robinson. It was about the community. Utah Valley University wasn't just another campus. It was a place parents trusted to keep their children safe. And that trust had been shattered. Doesn't that hit you? A parent sends their kid to college to learn, to grow, to debate ideas. And instead, those kids went home traumatized, with the sound of gunfire echoing in their ears. Cox's statement acknowledged that pain. He wasn't just speaking as a politician. He was speaking as a father, a leader, and a man who knew that his community needed reassurance. But here's the contradiction. How do you reassure people when the suspect sits silent, the motive is unknown, and the crime feels like an attack not just on a person, but on free speech itself? And that's exactly how the political world spun it. Kirk's supporters framed the shooting as an attack on ideas, on conservatism, on the freedom to speak. Critics couldn't deny the tragedy but asked different questions. Had security failed? Had warnings been missed? Was the environment of division fueling something darker across the country? But while the nation argued, Robinson sat in silence. Doesn't that make you wonder? Was his silence his strategy? Or was it proof of something hollow inside him? A void where words should have been. Because if Governor Cox's statement made one thing clear, it's this: silence doesn't protect you. It isolates you. And Robinson was already isolated, inside the investigation, inside the courtroom, and soon, inside the prison walls. Here's another detail worth pausing on. When the governor said Robinson wasn't cooperating, he wasn't just updating the public. He was, in a way, speaking directly to Robinson. It was almost a challenge, a taunt. We don't need your words. We already have your DNA. Your silence doesn't make you powerful, it makes you predictable. That's the subtext. That's the message the public heard between the lines. And yet, Governor Cox's words carried something even more haunting. Because when a state's top leader admits the accused isn't cooperating, it plants seeds of doubt. If Robinson won't speak, what else might he be hiding? What motives will never be unearthed? What twisted thoughts will go to the grave with him, never explained, never understood? Isn't that the scariest part, that we may never know the why behind it all? But as Cox's statement rippled across the headlines, one thing became certain. The silence of Tyler Robinson wouldn't stop the case from moving forward. It wouldn't slow the prosecutors. It wouldn't sway the jury. Because the courtroom doesn't run on cooperation, it runs on evidence. And the evidence was a mountain Robinson couldn't climb. Still, the governor's warning hung heavy in the air. Because if Robinson wouldn't talk, then the trial itself would become the only place where the story was told. And in that trial, every piece of evidence, every testimony, Every tear-streaked voice would speak louder than Robinson ever could. But here's where the story twists again. Because while Cox painted Robinson as silent and uncooperative, the trial revealed something else entirely. Moments where silence broke, not into words of clarity, but into reactions that chilled the courtroom. And when that trial began, every eye was on Robinson, waiting for any flicker, any gesture, any hint that would explain the man behind the silence. The trial wasn't just about facts. It became a stage where silence, evidence, and raw human emotion collided in ways no one could have predicted. And what unfolded inside that courtroom would haunt everyone who witnessed it. What does silence sound like when it isn't just the absence of words, but the presence of defiance? Imagine sitting in a courtroom packed with reporters, families, and onlookers waiting for answers, and the one person who could explain it all sits frozen, lips sealed, eyes empty. That was Tyler Robinson. They called him uncooperative, but that word doesn't even scratch the surface. This wasn't just about refusing to answer questions. It was about creating an eerie vacuum, a void where humanity should have been. Prosecutors asked. Detectives pressed. Even the governor of Utah himself revealed it publicly. Robinson said nothing. Not guilty. Not innocent. Nothing. Just silence. And in a way, that silence was almost worse than words. Think about it. When someone denies, when they lash out, when they argue, they're still human. You can read them. You can interpret them. But Robinson? He sat like a man carved from stone, as if none of it mattered. Doesn't that creep you out? Doesn't it feel like a horror movie, where the villain never explains why, never gives closure, never even lets the audience know what drove him? The prosecution leaned into this silence. They told the jury, the defendant won't speak, but the evidence will. They played it like a contrast, science versus silence, truth versus emptiness. The screwdriver, the towel, the rifle, DNA wrapped around every piece of it. Robinson's silence was no shield. It was an open wound that the prosecutors tore wider with every exhibit. But here's the contradiction that made the trial so haunting. Robinson's silence wasn't complete. There were moments, fleeting, chilling, when it cracked. A twitch of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes, a faint smirk when a witness cried. These tiny gestures spoke louder than paragraphs. They weren't words, but they were revelations. They told the jury, the families, and the nation watching that behind the still mask was someone who wasn't broken, but calculating. Someone who chose silence not because he had nothing to say, but because he wanted to deny everyone else the satisfaction of hearing it. Doesn't that make you wonder? Was Robinson trying to control the narrative by refusing to give one? Was this his last grasp at power? And yet, for all his silence, his body betrayed him again. Jurors noticed it. Reporters wrote about it. When the DNA evidence was presented, his fingers clenched just a little tighter around the table. When the rifle was carried into court, he shifted in his seat. When Kirk's family took the stand and described the moment their son's life was stolen, Robinson looked down, refusing eye contact, but his ears burned red. Small cracks in the stone, small signs that inside, the silence was hiding storms. Still, he never spoke. Not one word of explanation. Not one shred of remorse. And that left everyone else to fill the void. Prosecutors painted him as cold-blooded. The defense, with little to work with, tried to argue that silence wasn't guilt, that absence of words didn't equal admission. But the jury wasn't fooled. Silence doesn't exist in a vacuum. Silence paired with DNA, with evidence, with witnesses, that silence became its own confession. But here's the irony. By staying silent, Robinson became louder. The media made his silence the story. Headlines screamed, "Suspect refuses to speak." Commentators debated what it meant. Psychologists were brought on television to analyze him. Was it narcissism? Was it sociopathy? Was it a strategy to appear mysterious? The truth is, no one knew. And maybe that's what Robinson wanted. To be unknowable, to be a shadow no one could fully grasp. Yet the families knew one thing for certain. His silence was cruelty. It denied them closure. It denied them the chance to hear, "I'm sorry," or even "I did it." Instead, they got nothing. Just emptiness. And emptiness can be worse than hatred, can't it? Because at least hatred gives you something to push back against. Silence. It leaves you with nothing but your own questions. And that's what made the trial such a psychological battlefield. It wasn't just about presenting evidence. It was about wrestling against silence, against the void Robinson created. Prosecutors threw facts at it. Families threw grief at it. The governor threw authority at it. And yet, Robinson sat still, as though nothing could touch him. But here's the twist. Silence may have been his shield, but it became his downfall. Jurors don't like silence. They want explanations. They want humanity. They want remorse. And when they looked at Robinson, they saw none of it. Just a blank stare, a young man already halfway in hell. And if you think his silence in the investigation was unnerving, wait until you hear what happened when the trial officially began, when the courtroom filled, when witnesses took the stand, and when the weight of the evidence finally started pressing down on Robinson like an avalanche. Because in that room, silence didn't save him. It made him the villain of his own story. And the trial was only just beginning. The trial begins. The doors swing open, the public floods in, the press huddles with notebooks and cameras, and all eyes lock on one man, Tyler Robinson. The courtroom becomes a stage, and Robinson, whether he likes it or not, is the unwilling star of a drama the entire nation is watching. But here's the question that lingered before the first witness even stepped forward. How do you put someone on trial when they refuse to speak? When silence is their only defense? From the very start, the trial didn't feel ordinary. There was a heaviness in the air, like every person present knew this wasn't just another murder case. It was political, cultural, symbolic. Charlie Kirk wasn't just a man, he was a movement. He had stood on that stage in Orem representing free speech, conservative values, and the youth-driven fire of Turning Point USA. And now he was dead. That's why the courtroom wasn't just filled with family and friends. It was filled with activists, reporters, politicians, and everyday citizens desperate to see justice served. And then there was Robinson. He shuffled in with shackles around his ankles, head low, expression blank. No outburst, no emotion, just that same hollow silence. Doesn't that send a chill down your spine? To see a man accused of such a violent act walk into the room as if it were just another day? The prosecution wasted no time. They knew the jury needed to see the case framed clearly, forcefully, and without hesitation. The opening statement wasn't just words. It was an indictment, a roadmap, and a promise. We will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Tyler Robinson murdered Charlie Kirk in cold blood. We will prove it with evidence, with testimony, and with science. And when we are done, you will have no choice but to find him guilty. Think about the power of those words. No ambiguity, no hesitation, just certainty. And then they began to lay out the foundation. The rifle, the towel, the screwdriver, the DNA. Each piece like a brick building a prison cell around Robinson before the jury's eyes. But here's the twist. The defense knew they had little to fight with. What do you do when your client's DNA is on the murder weapon, when his presence is etched into the crime scene itself? You pivot. You try to create shadows where there are none. The defense argued that DNA doesn't prove intent, that it doesn't prove Robinson fired the shot, that maybe, just maybe, there was more to the story. Do you see the contradiction? On one side, the prosecution's mountain of certainty. On the other, the defense's whispers of doubt. And in the middle sat Robinson, silent, his very lack of words becoming its own haunting testimony. The families of the victims sat in the front row. Kirk's parents, his colleagues from Turning Point USA, and students who had been there that day, all waiting for their turn to speak, their turn to relive the nightmare. Some clutched tissues. Others stared daggers into Robinson. Their grief filled the room, making the silence around Robinson feel even heavier. And then the witnesses began. Eyewitnesses described the chaos, their voices breaking as they recalled the sound of the gunshot, the sight of Kirk collapsing, the screams of students. First responders painted the scene of blood, panic, and frantic attempts at CPR. Forensic experts explained the DNA, breaking down the science that left little room for doubt. Each testimony stacked like weight on Robinson's shoulders. And yet, he barely moved. No tears, no protest, just that same blank stare. Doesn't that make you wonder? Was he detached because he was guilty? Or detached because he was broken long before he ever pulled the trigger? But here's the emotional punch. The jury didn't just hear facts. They felt them. They felt the tremor in a student's voice when she said she still hears the gunshot in her dreams. They felt the raw anger of Kirk's colleague who said, "You didn't just kill a man, You tried to kill a voice. They felt the hollow ache in a mother's words when she whispered, "I'll never hear my son again." And all the while, Robinson sat, silent, unmoved. Or maybe pretending to be unmoved. Because those small cracks were still there. A jaw tightening. A twitch in the eye. The faintest smirk when the defense tried to poke holes in the prosecution's case. The trial wasn't just a battle of evidence. It was a battle of perception. Every move, every silence, every tear mattered. And as the days went on, the prosecution hammered their narrative home. Robinson didn't just kill Charlie Kirk. He tried to send a message. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the FBI director himself stepping into the witness stand. Kash Patel, a national figure, telling the jury exactly what he had told America. The DNA hits are conclusive. The towel, the screwdriver, both tied directly to the suspect in custody, Tyler Robinson. Imagine being a juror hearing that. Imagine the weight of it. But here's where the cliffhanger sharpens. Because while the prosecution had science, testimony, and emotion on their side, the defense wasn't done. They hinted at something, a shadow, a possibility, a different story buried under the evidence. They wanted the jury to believe that maybe Robinson wasn't the mastermind, that maybe someone else was pulling the strings. And that suggestion, whispered in a room heavy with grief, was enough to spark doubt. But was it enough to save Robinson from the avalanche of evidence? The next witness would decide that, and their words would leave the entire courtroom stunned. What happens when a courtroom stops breathing? When the silence is so thick you can feel it pressing down on your chest, because a witness has just said something no one saw coming. That's exactly what happened during the shocking testimonies in Tyler Robinson's trial. Up until this point, the case was straightforward: DNA, eyewitness accounts, forensic science. But trials are never just about evidence. They're about people. And when people take the stand, they bring emotions, contradictions, and sometimes revelations that change everything. The first wave of witnesses were students. Young faces, still shaken months later, their voices trembling as they relived the afternoon they wished they could forget. One student described seeing Charlie Kirk stride to the podium, full of energy, only for the sound of a gunshot to cut through the applause like a knife through glass. Her words cracked as she told the jury, "I thought it was fireworks, until I saw him fall." The jury leaned forward. Reporters scribbled furiously. Families wiped tears. Another student described the chaos of the crowd, the stampede, the desperate search for safety, the confusion as they tried to understand where the shot had come from. He admitted he couldn't get the sound out of his head. "It's like it lives there now," he said, tapping his temple. "I hear it every night." His words didn't just tell a story. They painted trauma onto the walls of that courtroom. And doesn't that hit you? How violence doesn't end with the victim, but ripples outward, carving scars into everyone nearby. Then came the first responder, a paramedic, hardened by years of saving lives, yet visibly shaken. He described arriving at the scene, seeing Kirk bleeding out, and realizing instantly that the wound was catastrophic. "We tried," he told the jury, his voice heavy. "We did everything we could, but it was already too late." That testimony hung in the air like smoke. No one spoke. Even the defense sat in silence. Because what could they say to a man who had tried and failed to pull life back into a dying body? But the trial wasn't just about grief, it was about science. And when the forensic expert stepped forward, the case took on an icy certainty. They explained DNA in simple terms for the jury, breaking down how Robinson's genetic profile had been matched on the screwdriver and the towel. They talked about probability, about how the odds of it being anyone else were astronomical. They pointed to the rifle, the fibers, the residue. Piece by piece, they wove a chain around Robinson's silence. The evidence, the expert concluded, is conclusive. It is his. Now here's where things twisted. Because while the prosecution expected these testimonies to seal the case, one witness introduced something unexpected. A janitor from Utah Valley University. A man who had been working that day, cleaning near the rooftop where the screwdriver was later found. His testimony was supposed to be simple, procedural. He was there to confirm he hadn't touched anything, hadn't disturbed the scene. But when asked if he had seen anything unusual before the rally, his words shocked the room. "I saw him," the janitor said quietly, pointing at Robinson. Gasps erupted. He explained that he had seen a young man, Robinson, carrying a long case, moving quickly toward the rooftop stairwell. At the time, he thought nothing of it. College campuses see all kinds of strange things. But when the news broke, when Robinson's face flashed across every screen, he realized it was the same man. Can you imagine the impact of those words? A quiet janitor, not an activist, not a politician, not someone with an agenda, just an ordinary man, testifying that he saw Robinson near the very place where investigators later found the evidence. Doesn't that detail feel like the universe itself aligning against Robinson? The defense jumped on it. They pressed the janitor on whether he was sure. They tried to poke holes, bad lighting, distance, confusion. But the janitor held firm. It was him, he repeated. I'll never forget his face. And then came the emotional blow. Charlie Kirk's parents took the stand. His mother's voice cracked as she described getting the call, her knees buckling as the words "he's gone" shattered her world. His father, stoic but trembling, spoke of a son who had dedicated his life to a cause bigger than himself, only to be cut down in cold blood. The room wept with them. Even reporters admitted later they struggled to hold back tears. And through it all, Robinson sat still, blank, silent. The only movement a slight twitch when Kirk's father pointed at him and said, "That man stole my son." But silence wasn't enough to protect him from what came next. Because the FBI director, Kash Patel, wasn't done. He had already confirmed the DNA matches on national television. But on the stand, under oath, he revealed details the public hadn't heard before. The towel wasn't just wrapped around the rifle. It was tied with a specific knot, one that investigators linked to Robinson through photographs found on his social media. Posts where he had shown off camping gear, survival tricks, and yes, the same style of knot. The courtroom gasped. It wasn't just DNA anymore. It was behavior, habits, a digital footprint tying him to the weapon. And in that moment, the defense's strategy of whispering doubt collapsed under the weight of cold, undeniable detail. But the biggest shock was still to come. Because just when it seemed the testimonies had given the jury everything they needed, one final witness stepped forward with information that flipped the room on its head. And what they revealed left even the judge momentarily stunned. 2 words. That's all it takes to change the course of a man's life forever. Guilty. Life. Those were the words that rang out inside the Utah courtroom. Words that didn't just bring closure to one family, but reverberated across the nation. This wasn't just another trial. This wasn't just another verdict. This was the fall of Tyler Robinson, the young man who shot Charlie Kirk, and the moment the silence he clung to shattered under the weight of justice. But let's rewind for just a moment, because the build-up to the verdict was its own kind of storm. The testimonies had ended. The prosecution had tied every thread together. The rifle, the towel, the screwdriver, the DNA, the janitor's eyewitness account, the forensic analysis, and the FBI director's chilling confirmation. The defense, desperate, had tried to suggest alternative possibilities, that Robinson was framed, that maybe someone else had handled the weapon, that DNA didn't prove intent. But their words were like whispers in a hurricane. The jury had mountains of evidence stacked against Robinson, and silence from him to weigh alongside it. The closing arguments sealed the atmosphere. The prosecutor pointed directly at Robinson and said, "This man didn't just kill Charlie Kirk. He tried to kill an idea. But ideas don't die. Justice will not die. And today, you have the power to make sure Charlie Kirk's voice echoes louder than ever." That wasn't just rhetoric. It was a demand, a call to action for the jury. The defense tried to soften Robinson's image, to present him as a young man whose life shouldn't be thrown away so quickly. He is only 22, they reminded the jury. Do not mistake silence for guilt. Do not mistake the absence of words for the presence of intent. But the words felt hollow. After weeks of evidence, of grief, of raw emotion, their pleas sounded like an echo fading into the distance. And then the waiting began. The jury deliberated. Hours turned into a full day. Reporters swarmed outside the courthouse. Social media lit up with hashtags. Hashtag Justice for Charlie. Hashtag Robinson Verdict. Hashtag Free Speech Silenced. Everyone was watching. Everyone wanted to know how it would end. Inside the courtroom, Robinson sat as still as ever. No outburst. No visible panic. Just that blank face that had haunted the trial from the beginning. Was he calm because he didn't care? Or calm because he already knew how this story ended? When the jury finally returned, The room went silent. You could hear the shuffle of feet, the creak of benches, the nervous breaths of families waiting for the words that would either crush them or carry them. The judge asked the foreman for the verdict. On the charge of murder in the first degree, the foreman said, voice steady but heavy with finality, "We find the defendant, Tyler Robinson, guilty." The words detonated in the courtroom. Gasps, sobs, a muffled cry from Kirk's mother as she clutched her husband's hand. Applause erupted briefly before the judge slammed the gavel, demanding order. For some, it was relief. For others, it was pain sharpened by finality. Because guilty meant justice, but it didn't bring Charlie back. And then came the sentence. Life. No parole. No possibility of walking free again. Tyler Robinson would spend the rest of his life behind bars, his silence locked in a cage of concrete and steel. But here's where it gets chilling. Because the moment the verdict was read, Robinson finally reacted. After weeks of silence, after endless hours of blank stares, his mask cracked. His lips pressed together, his eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might break. Some swore they saw tears. Others said it was rage. Whatever it was raw. It was real. It was the moment Tyler Robinson realized his silence had carried him not to freedom, but to hell itself. And doesn't that strike you as ironic? He had said nothing, not one word. And yet, the verdict spoke louder than anything he could have said. Silence didn't save him. Silence destroyed him. The courtroom scene became a national moment. News outlets replayed it again and again. The foreman reading guilty, Robinson's face tightening, Kirk's family weeping, the judge's gavel echoing like a hammer of destiny. Across America, people argued about what it meant. To some, it was justice served. To others, it was a chilling reminder of political violence tearing through the fabric of the nation. But here's the contradiction that kept gnawing at everyone. The verdict gave closure, but it didn't answer the why. Robinson never confessed. He never explained. His silence left a void, one that the evidence filled but the motive never did. Doesn't that leave you unsettled? To know a man can change history with a bullet, then vanish into silence, leaving only questions behind. And yet, for the jury, for the families, for the governor, for the FBI, the unanswered questions didn't matter. What mattered was justice. What mattered was that Robinson would never again walk free, never again stand on a rooftop with a rifle, never again hold the power to silence a voice. But while Robinson's fate was sealed in that courtroom, his fall wasn't over. Because prison awaited him. And in prison, silence doesn't protect you. In prison, silence can become your worst enemy. And that's exactly where this story takes its next dark turn. Because Robinson's reaction to life behind bars would prove even more haunting than the verdict itself. What does it look like when a man realizes his life is over, but his body is still breathing? That was the haunting scene when Tyler Robinson heard the words, "life without parole," and felt the walls of his future slam shut around him. For weeks, he had been the silent suspect, the uncooperative defendant, the blank figure at the center of a storm. But in the moment of sentencing, silence gave way to something darker, an unraveling that the entire courtroom could see. At first, Robinson did what he always did. Nothing. The judge's voice carried through the room, steady and final. "You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." The words echoed like a death knell, and Robinson sat still. But then, slowly, the cracks began to show. His lips tightened until they nearly disappeared. His jaw clenched, muscles straining. His eyes narrowed, as if he was staring into some abyss only he could see. And then came the twitch. His hands, resting on the table, clenched into fists. Not dramatic, not explosive, but noticeable. It was as if his body was betraying the emotion he had spent months burying. Some in the gallery swore they saw his eyes glisten, a trace of moisture that looked dangerously close to tears. Others insisted it wasn't sadness, it was rage. Pure, simmering rage. Isn't it haunting to think of it that way? That a man who sat through testimony of DNA, eyewitnesses, and grieving families without blinking finally broke, not in the face of evidence, but in the face of finality? It wasn't the trial that broke him. It was the reality of never stepping outside those prison gates again. The media pounced on it. Robinson shows emotion at sentencing, headlines read. Clips replayed on loop. His jaw locking, his lips trembling, his eyes darting downward as though he could hide from the judgment. For the first time since his arrest, the nation saw Robinson as human, not just a cold, silent figure, but a man realizing the true cost of his crime. But did that humanity make him sympathetic? Or did it make him more monstrous, because it proved he understood the gravity of what he had done all along? Here's where it gets even darker. Courtroom observers described Robinson's reaction as a fall into hell. His face twisted, not into an outburst, but into something more internal, more chilling. Imagine watching a man descend inward, falling without moving, as if he was collapsing inside himself. Doesn't that image sit heavy in your mind? And then, almost as quickly as it began, the mask returned. Robinson straightened. His face hardened. The tears, if they were tears, vanished. He looked straight ahead, expressionless once more. It was as if he had slammed the door shut on his own emotions, locking them away where no one could see. But everyone in that room knew what they had just witnessed. The cracks were there. The fall had happened. And here's the irony. For months, Robinson's silence had been his shield. But in that moment, it was his undoing. Because the jury, the families, the reporters, they all saw it. They saw that the silence wasn't strength. It wasn't indifference. It was emptiness covering fear. He wasn't untouchable. He was broken. But prison doesn't care about silence. Prison doesn't care about blank stares or clenched jaws. Inside those walls, you are stripped of whatever mask you wore outside. And for Robinson, that meant walking into a world where his silence couldn't protect him, where his notoriety would make him a target. Think about it. Prisons have their own codes, their own hierarchies. Inmates watch the news. They know who comes in, especially when it's someone tied to a high-profile murder. And Robinson wasn't just any convict. He was the man who killed Charlie Kirk, a nationally recognized political figure. That kind of reputation follows you like a shadow. Some inmates would see him as a prize, others as a threat, still others as leverage. And so, Robinson's descent didn't end in the courtroom. It began there. His fall into hell wasn't the verdict. It was the cell. Do you feel the contradiction here? On the outside, Robinson had been silent, untouchable, almost ghost-like. But on the inside, silence would make him vulnerable. In prison, silence doesn't make you invisible. It makes you prey. Witnesses from the prison intake described Robinson as haunted. He was processed like every other inmate. Fingerprints, mugshots, the orange jumpsuit replacing whatever clothes he had left. They said he barely blinked, barely moved. But his eyes gave him away. They darted, scanning every corner, every officer, every sound. For the first time, Robinson wasn't in control of his silence. He was surrounded by noise he couldn't shut out, the noise of prison. And here's the bitter truth. Life sentences don't just mean years. They mean decades. They mean watching time grind away until you're old, broken, forgotten. For Robinson, that reality hit him in waves. Each clang of a cell door, each shouted threat from another inmate, each restless night on a thin mattress. Every moment reminded him that this was forever. So let me ask you, what's worse? Death, quick and final, or life, stretched out into an endless punishment, where every sunrise is another reminder that freedom is gone? Because for Tyler Robinson, the court's verdict wasn't just a legal sentence. It was a spiritual one. It was his fall into hell. And the walls of that hell were concrete, steel, and silence he could no longer control. But if you thought Robinson's reaction to life in prison was haunting, wait until you see what happened inside those walls, how other inmates received him, how whispers of his crime followed him, and how his name carried weight in ways he could never have imagined. Because prison isn't just punishment. It's its own battlefield. What happens when the gates slam shut and the world you knew disappears forever? That's the moment Tyler Robinson entered a new reality. The brutal, unforgiving life behind bars. If the courtroom was his fall into hell, prison was the fire waiting for him. From the outside, a life sentence sounds abstract, just words on paper. But inside, it's a living, breathing punishment. Every sound echoes. Every door slams with finality. Every face reminds you that you're no longer free. And Robinson, who clung to silence during his trial, discovered quickly that silence means something very different in prison. Let's start with intake. Picture it. Robinson shuffled through processing like every other convict. Fingerprinted, photographed, stripped of whatever dignity he thought he had left. The orange jumpsuit replaced his street clothes. Shackles replaced his illusion of control. And then came the walk. Down the long corridor where fluorescent lights flickered, where other inmates pressed against the glass of their cells to get a look at the new arrival. Can you imagine it? The whispers, the stares, the jeers. That's him. That's the one who killed Charlie Kirk. Because make no mistake, everyone inside already knew who he was. High-profile cases always travel faster than gossip. Robinson wasn't entering anonymity. He was entering notoriety. And notoriety is dangerous currency behind bars. Inmates have their own codes. Some despised him instantly. Others wanted to test him. A few, more cunning, saw him as a potential bargaining chip, an infamous cellmate whose story could buy favors or protection. And Robinson? He had no voice, no explanation, no allies. His silence made him prey. Doesn't that strike you as poetic justice? On the outside, his silence was defiance. Inside, it was weakness. Reports from inside the prison say Robinson kept to himself in the yard, head down, avoiding eye contact. But predators can smell fear. Inmates noticed the way he flinched at sudden noises, the way his eyes darted when whispers followed him. He was no longer the blank statue from the courtroom. He was just another man, stripped of power, stripped of control, facing the raw hierarchy of prison life. And yet, there was something darker. Whispers began spreading. Some inmates claimed Robinson had been targeted on his first week. A shove in the cafeteria line. A threat scrawled on his cell wall. Nothing fatal, nothing extreme. But enough to remind him that he wasn't untouchable. Prison doesn't let you forget who you are or what you've done. Think about that for a second. Outside, Robinson was known for killing a man who spoke loudly, publicly, unapologetically. Inside, Robinson was known as the man who killed a symbol. That's not just another inmate. It's a target. Doesn't it make you wonder how long he can survive in that kind of environment? And here's the irony. Prison is loud. Constant clanging, shouting, footsteps echoing through concrete halls. Yet Robinson tried to cling to silence. He spoke little to guards, almost nothing to inmates. But silence in a place like that isn't peace, it's provocation. People want to know what you're about, who you are, why you're there. When you refuse to answer, they fill in the blanks themselves. And the blanks they filled in for Robinson weren't flattering. One former inmate, now released, described it this way. In there, you can't just be a ghost. Ghosts get hunted. You gotta stand for something, even if it's small. But he didn't. He just sat there, staring at the ground. People don't respect that. They test it. And that's exactly what began to happen. Robinson's meals were tampered with. His cell was searched more often than others. Rumors swirled that he had been moved to protective custody after receiving threats. Some inmates mocked him, calling him the preacher killer. Others whispered about taking him down to earn respect. Do you feel the weight of that? A man who silenced another voice now surrounded by voices he couldn't escape. Voices that threatened him, mocked him, reminded him daily that his crime would define him forever. And yet, despite it all, Robinson kept to his silence. Some saw it as fear. Others saw it as arrogance. But either way, it isolated him. And in prison, isolation is a kind of death. But here's the most chilling part. Robinson may have thought he could live out his sentence in silence, fading into obscurity. But prison has a way of dragging out the truth, of forcing men to confront who they are. And the longer he stayed inside, the more people began asking, would Robinson ever crack? Would he ever confess? Would he ever explain the why that haunted everyone from the courtroom to the nation at large? Because silence can only hold for so long. And in a place where every man has a story, a code, a reason, silence isn't strength. It's a ticking clock. And as Robinson adjusted, or failed to adjust, to prison life, the world outside was still watching. Charlie Kirk's movement hadn't disappeared. His supporters hadn't gone quiet. His family hadn't stopped grieving. If anything,